And then eventually I started digging more into print. I found it had this amazing vernacular historically of how it encompasses everything.
Hello, print friends, and welcome. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release weekly episodes with people around the world who share our love of printmaking. If you like what we do, please rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts. That really does help. Or just tell a fellow friend about the podcast and maybe they'll enjoy it too. We also have a Patreon page where supporters can join at tiers that start at just $1 a month, and that helps keep us bringing you printmaking content every week. You can also get thank yous like exclusive merchandise, as well as access to our bonus content, Shop Talk with our editor, Timothy Pauschak. These are chats for the printmaker's printmaker. They talk about color theory, materials, chemistry, and lots of nuts and bolts, down-to-earth professional advice. How do you keep your practice dynamic after you graduate? How do you save money on supplies? What's your favorite paper? So if that sounds like something you're interested in, you can check out the link in the show notes and hear Tim's chat with today's guest. And if you want to save a little cash while still supporting the show, you can sign up for a yearly subscription and receive 15% off the tier price. Printmaking forever. Shun the non-believers. Hello, Print Friend is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been offering a diverse range of high-quality products to your creative practice since 1997. But we all know that these products do not use themselves, and that's why Speedball works with a fantastic lineup of contemporary printmakers who make up Speedball's team of demo artists. Artists like Tess Doyle, a freelance artist and designer working in Houston, Texas. Tess works primarily in printmaking, drawing, and mixed media. Inspired by pop culture, personal idols, victims, and everyday encounters, she creates an array of figurative and symbol-heavy imagery. Her drawings and prints often contain bizarre narratives and pastiche. So if you want to learn a few tricks of the trade from exciting artists like Tess, head on over to Speedball's YouTube channel and see how it's done. There's a link in the show notes. My guest this week is Mitch Mitchell, Assistant Professor of Print Media at Concordia University in Montreal. We'll talk about the process of printmaking as product, labor both physical and emotional, taking on printmaking projects that require thousands of hours to finish, and starting his tabletop printing press company to help connect printmakers with equipment during lockdown and COVID. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to get to work with Mitch Mitchell. Hi, Mitch. How's it going?
Good. How are you, Miranda?
I'm really good. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you.
Well,
it's good to talk to somebody from across the sea.
Yeah, I know, the international print family, hey? Like, this is always a really exciting part of what I get to do here. Yeah. So I was actually introduced, I think I just found part of what you do through the ye old Instagram. And then I actually got an anonymous tip to the Hello Print Friend email account that you would be someone who would be lovely to talk to. And so I did a little bit of research then and looked at your website and looked at your work. And I was really, really excited about what I saw and was just super happy to have the opportunity to talk with you about the wonderful work that you're making and your printing presses as well, which I'm sure we'll get to sort of both sides of what you do at some point in this chat. So thank you, anonymous tipster, I guess, for pointing me in this
Thank you very
direction.
much, anonymous sister.
Yeah. So I'm a bit familiar with you because I always do the research leading up to these interviews. But how would you describe for our listening fans out there who you are, where you are, and what you do?
I'm a print-based artist. I work primarily with the forms of print and histories of print, both past, present, and future. I'm much more my practice has gone more into the materiality of print and the process of print versus sort of the technique and the sort of the narrative histories with a technique drive holds in itself, but more focused on the drive of the making and the labor-based process to tell these sort of like narrative stories. But now I'm located in Montreal, Quebec, in Canada. I'm originally from the United States, from Illinois, both Springfield and Chicago region. And I've been just sort of traveling the world for quite a majority of my life now, sort of taking in as much as I can about life and image and the graphic space that we live in to sort of find ways of telling a story, whether it be curious or oblique or whatever it may be, to sort of add to the lexicon, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you mentioned that you grew up in Illinois. What was your sort of early exposure to art and your early interfacing with making like?
I was very fortunate to have parents that was my father was worked for the states, but he's a gentleman of many hats. One, he worked for the state in small business and community affairs, and for the majority of my life, and he's now luckily retired from that business. And but at the same time, he's also a landscape architect, and so I grew up around his pencils and his paper and his schematic designs and his drafting board that his grandfather had made him whenever he left school when he was in his 20s. So I grew up around all that, looking at things, and then I was very fortunate in the sense that both my parents would take us kids to art galleries and museums, no matter what it was. It didn't have to be a museum specific to one culture. It was like you're going to see everything, and because it's all of value, no matter what it is. And they never said like this is more important than this. It was this is just important. And having grown up with that, it sort of just fed me in a way where when I was a kid, I had this obnoxious amount of energy to draw and to make things. I think a little bit of childlike ADHD or whatever, maybe you can call it that. And so that sort of fed the furnace, if you will. And they never said, no, you shouldn't do this. You should focus on being a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. They said, like, here's more paper, here's more pencils. I can't believe you can draw a straight line. Just go for it. And I mean, because they were just enamored by it, I guess, and just to follow where your soul goes, in a sense. And then I also I had a good amount of friends and community around me that were also musicians and had lived really extensive lives beyond just their houses. Like had been in World War II, had been in Vietnam, had been musicians for jazz musicians, and I mean, if you've ever been to Chicago, you'll know that it's just a lively, boisterous city where everybody wants to tell their story. And so it's part of that heart, if you will, of the Midwest, where it's a community of, immigrants and the post-slavery movement and everything and all that stuff that sort of built the entirety of the Midwestern culture that kind of I grew up around.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And then where does printmaking come into your story?
It kind of started in two distinctly different ways. One was at school when I was in university, when I was doing a double major for engineering and arts. And then obviously when you go to art school, you're like, here's painting and sculpture.
Right.
And it was like the big A art, in North America. But then I heard about printmaking, but I didn't want to take it because at the same time I was working. In high school, I used to work for a silkscreen shop, and it was one of those old school, all labor, all by hand. You're pulling 800 to 2,000 runs a day by no machines. You're the machine, and I was like, I can't do that anymore. So I was kind of hesitant about it, but then I had a professor who was quite amazing. And she's a painting professor by L.J. Douglas, and she's still in Normal, Illinois, and she still teaches there. And she was absolutely amazing because she said she was sort of like was breaking down the way I work and more of a mechanical nature, and it was sort of like, you should try print. And so I did, and it was, and I absolutely loved it. It was something I didn't expect. So then I did an intaglio class with a professor who's now back in Canada by Sean Caulfield. And then I had an amazing instructor, and sort of opened my eyes to what print can be versus what it is. And then I had a litho professor who was one of the elder litho professors of the age, by the name of Jim Butler, who was this amazing sage of a person who could just on the fly figure out anything that was happening to a stone, and like would make the mysterious magical. Yeah. And but he'd also challenge you at the same time. He was very much a very strict and old school lithographer, where it's all about technique and procedure. But then he'd also throw monkey wrenches into sort of the pedagogy, if you will, and sort of say like, okay, you're going to make a litho, but you're not going to use a litho press, and so on. Mm-hmm. So just make it more conceptual, have fun with it, and so on. So that was sort of like the thing that sort of opened my eyes to what print could be. So that was the beginning of it, and from there I just absolutely fell in love with it. I obnoxiously, I had one professor say I was a very obnoxious student because I graduated with a painting BFA, and but my whole show was printmaking and glass sculpture. So I remember my opening, my BFA show, and he came up to me and said, like, "You're such an obnoxious student." Ugh.
You just gotta bend and break those rules, hey?
Yeah. So and from there, I just sort of I just kept going with it. I fell in love with the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now I think that's a really nice way to segue into your current practice, because as you were bending and breaking the rules of being a painting major, I think one could say that perhaps you do the same as a print-based artist as well. And so sort of what I mean by that is that you're not following it's a multiple, they all look the same, and they go under glass, and they, then you addition them. That's not really how printmaking manifests in the work that you do. So I guess I'd maybe just invite you to kind of describe your practice more broadly, as you do a lot of installation work, a lot of sculpture work, but then also invite you to let us know how printmaking fits into that and why you think it's important to use that as opposed to any other medium to create your end goal.
Yeah, that's good. I think it has to do with a bit going back to how I grew up and saying that everything's important, like my mom would say. And that, one of the things that I found to be very enlightening about the process from the very beginning of print was not so much the effect of ink on paper through the press via a intaglio plate or litho or relief. It was more just like this performative process from beginning to end. It's like when you buy the paper, you see the person who's ringing up the dollar amount, and then they take your cash, which is also made of a linen-based paper, a cotton-based paper, and then you unfold it, and then which is also a multiple, it's an addition, and it's an intaglio, and then U.S. currency. If anybody's not listening who is not in the U.S. And then from there, they take your paper and they roll it up, and then they put another piece of protective paper around it with a rubber band. It becomes this really because when you buy the paper, it comes in this. You buy it in this flat file. It's super flat and it's pristine. But immediately, as soon as you take it to the cash register, you're very carefully, gingerly holding it because it's of value. But then they take it and they're kind of rough with it, and they roll it up as tight as they can be, and they just like they treat it like currency, their version of currency, where they kind of just like, here you go, thank you very much, goodbye.
Yeah.
And I found that to be really compelling, how in comparison, or in on a polar level, when we teach, I'm a professor at Concordia University. I teach print, so I'm always teaching the value of materials and the process. So at the same time, I have to like go against that, and in my own practice, I'm like, I have to bend and break those rules. So I think that's one of the things that really attracted me to it, was there was this other side of the material surface that you can always damage it, and you can find the soul in the wrinkle or the crease that you could not find by illustrating it on the stone or whatever it may be. So that was sort of like the impetus where it kind of started gestating. And then eventually, when I started getting more in depth and digging more into print, I found it had this amazing vernacular historically of how just it encompasses everything. Like every culture has print, whether it be art, and the perception of art within print is very small comparatively to the graphic image as a culture and as a whole, because you have currency, you have documents, you have visas, you have everything in your life has been printed on checks. I don't know, you name it around you, mail, it's been printed on. So I realized that there was this cultural inheritance to the surface beyond just the big A art form that I could just mine and sort of dig into and find a volume that is beyond me as culturally, but also that I share in it because I am a part of that conversation in some way. So that was sort of like the beginning stages of that. So when I broke out of that, I realized, well, what is my story? What can I do with this? And then I started sort of thinking about the object and the space and how we move around cities and the world through the graphic. And we're always looking at the graphic image. And that was, say, like, well, what if I make objects? What if I make, and we have cereal boxes that are printed. We have Amazon boxes coming to us every day that are printed. And then, well, there's a whole wealth of, we're surrounded by print, but we just don't talk about it.
Yeah. And we don't think about it that way. Like when you get your Amazon box, you're not like, look at the nice registration on this. You never engage with it that way, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And we kind of throw it away, this throwaway culture. And I found that to be these really polar opposites that I actually found very attracted to. And then I'm also very just attracted to just narrative space and how we describe things, and historically as well as on a contemporary level, and how we look at and examine these things that we all culturally share and are responsible for, but we don't responsibly talk about. Because there's a lot of darkness that goes with it, as well as beauty. So that was so a lot of my work has to sort of like, it's a long way of saying that my work, I really think about how the graphic image and the substrate that it's on can help sort of narratively dictate where the audience can go into the work, not lead them, but just sort of open the door into the work so they can bring their own baggage with that. And so, but still have a bit of an inkling or a point of view that I'm trying to drive them through with that. So, yeah.
Definitely. And I think also you've talked about, labor-based process and the way that labor is important to your work. And I love how when you're starting to talk about print, you're not just starting in the studio because, so I soak my paper, that's often like sort of where people think about the labor of printmaking starting, but you really take it back to that first moment of physicality with the materials, which is when you go into an art store and you pick out your piece of paper and you exchange money, which I love. Like, of course, you point out is also print, but then of course, money also represents labor, basically, as well. There are these notes that hold this value of, an hour's worth of work or whatever it is. So, and so it kind of starts there and just continues on, until, well, really just indefinitely, sort of truly, like as long as the object exists. So I'm often really excited to talk about the way labor shows up in the context of art, and particularly in the context of print, because the word is, laden with a lot of associations with, let's see, I don't know how to put it. So it's like when people say labor, you'll often kind of think of a laborer, maybe someone who is working with their hands, and maybe someone who's doing more blue collar jobs. But of course, that is what artists are as well. In many, many, many media, of course, that is actually just someone who is taking materials and creating something, someone who is problem solving. I just had a wonderful interview a couple days ago with Stacey Lynn Waddell, and she was talking about how she grew up on a farm and how she thinks that's what made her an artist, was seeing people saying like, okay, like how do I create something based with the materials that I have? And that's just, of course, what artists do. And that's the labor, right? So I am always excited to talk about it because I like it as a subject. And then also Tim, who you'll be talking to later on today with Shop Talk, that was a huge part of his thesis. He comes from a factory town with factory workers in his family, and that idea of labor intersecting with printmaking specifically. So long lead up to my question, which is just, I love this topic. How does it affect your practice? How does it show up in what you do? This idea of labor and creating, labor in printmaking, labor in process, all of that great stuff.
It's a good question. I think it's a massive. It's been slowly moving towards that. My work, been kind of shying away from it for a long period because I do come from a sort of a blue collar family and sort of a history with coal mining in the family and all that. So, but it wasn't until this the more recent large body of work that I did, I Will Meet You in the Sun, where I really just said hey, I'm going to go for it. I was very fortunate to have a curator that really responded to the work, said I don't think you're going hard enough in the work. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna go hard now. And that's when I decided to take labor as an identity towards the psychological term as a point of reference for the psychological inner turmoil that an individual or individuals may be going through, that sort of you see it and you think, oh, this is beautiful, but then you really look at it and you respond to it okay, this is madness because there's so much of it, and you realize it. And one individual hand made all of this, and it kind of goes on this that long joke that a lot of we had in art school, where it's I hear a lot from the painters that would be like, oh man, I don't want to take print because you have to do additions, and I can't 5. It's insane. So with that body of work I did, there's one piece I presented where I made 50,000 handmade boxes.
Oh my gosh.
They're all, it took about 5 years to do.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah. So they're all individually silk screens, monotype silk screens, 2 layers each. And then I hand cut them out and then hand crease them with a bone folder and then hand glue them. And there's 50,000 of them. And the idea, because when you look at it, it's beautiful. The response is it's colorful, it's beautiful. These boxes, they're like toys. You have all these sort of childlike qualities, or this. You want to they're very tactile. You want to play with them, and but when you get close to them, you realize that they're all individual, they're all unique. But then there's that sort of step back that happens, a mental step back that happens when you realize, oh no, this person's insane. What would cause a person to do this? And there's that sort of mental fatigue that kicks in, where it's there's a brand new identity to it. It's no longer about, beauty. It's no longer about sort of something that is just, visually looks good. There's a turmoil that sort of is embodied in it. And so that piece, it literally was the impetus for it was the psychology of what my grandparents had to go through. And the idea that they had both been through, my grandfather had been through World War II. He had been part of the unbeknownst to him at the time, but he was a radar operator for the Hiroshima bombing. And he had to keep that secret. He died with it because it was classified. So he had to keep that secret. And he died with that secret. But I always imagine, like, you know, working in the coal mines, sort of like over his table saw and all that stuff, just like what the Scots Irish back home would say, like you just work out the devil. Like if you don't want to think about it, you just work. You just work. And it's something that I always heard growing up is like, if something's bothering you, just work it out. Just sort of just go and do something until you stop thinking about it. So the idea of labor as something that's very physical, but it's also very psychological and something that we don't really want to address sometimes. Not only the physical fatigue, but the mental fatigue that can be far more dangerous, if you will. So
yeah. So I've was just writing notes furiously as you're talking there. But I just have to say, like, I think my first reaction was just like, eat your fucking heart out, people. Like, come on. Like, see, I actually made 50,000 boxes. Come on. Like, so that's my first reaction, but that's, you know, I don't have to get into my personal biases about NTFs, but also, you know, this idea of that kind of repetitive labor, which can be both healing and harming, is super interesting because I know that the more that we understand trauma and how it works, the more that we're coming to understand that it lives in your body. You know, there's this kind of famous, wonderful book, The Body Keeps Score, you know, which was sort of I think who first brought that idea to lay people that, you know, it's, if you've gone through something, you know, almost literally lives in your body, and you have to get it out of your body in order to be on the other side of that. And that can be through something like labor. There's a really wonderful documentary about Buck Brenneman, the horse whisperer, the guy that it was all based on. And, you know, he came from an exceptionally physically abusive household with a alcoholic father. And he ends up going to this family, like sort of a foster family. And the first thing that happens, and this is, you know, cowboys in Colorado in, you know, the 1960s, 70s, you know, this is far before, you know, somatic healing sound baths, you know, came into anyone's existence. But what his foster father did was he took him, you know, out into a field and he handed him a pair of leather gloves and he said, this boy needs to work. Like, he just was like, this is what he needs. And so it reminds me of that, this idea that, you know, before we had these sort of sophisticated words and ways to explain what was actually happening in processing trauma, people still knew that. And people who labored knew that. You know, he was out there fixing fences with his foster father, and his foster father knew that this was healing because this is what he had done. And so, you know, I think it's a really interesting crossover, I think, between that blue collar work, that work with your hands, and then this thing that I feel like the kind of, I guess, like liberal elite, for lack of a better term, is sort of just trying to finally discovering now, is that like, oh, like that movement, that work actually is essentially a part of the healing as well. And so for you to take on something of this scale, it's just so fascinating in the sense that there's no shortcut to that. Like, you've chosen to take something on where the only way to get to the other side is to put your body through the paces and to put your body through the labor, which of course then also makes it a form of performance art in its own way, or sort of embodied art as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's where with that work, it was sort of my stepping stone where I just said, okay, I just got to go for it. And my latest, I mean, it generally takes me, for depending on the body of work, about 4 to 6 years to like complete a body of work, because it's so labor intensive and extensive. And I kind of keep it a secret, so I can just focus on doing it, and then all of a sudden it just comes out. I just release it to the wild, if you will. And my latest work has been much more. I've been exhibiting, not hiding the labor. I've been really wanting to actually present the labor as like that, as the performative act in situ with the work itself. And because it is justified, it is important. It helps tell a story. It should not be hidden.
Yeah.
Because it adds something else to it, maybe positive or negative, depending on how you want to look at it and so on. So it's there's one piece I did during that show I was remaking a hot air balloon out of a quilted paper, and it was just like people would be so confused about it, but it was also at the same time they found to be very blissful at the same time. So it was like this. I'm always playing with the darkness as well as the lightness, the poetics of those spaces.
Yeah.
I'm finding myself more. It's more human, if you will.
Yeah. Can you sort of say more about that in terms of the darkness? Will you go into the darkness, Mitch? That's how it's like
let's go into the darkness.
Let's do this. We got 30 minutes left in this interview. Let's dive. But can you? I'm intrigued by you sort of saying that, because it's just an interesting way to think about it. And so I'm hoping you can flesh it out a little bit more so I can understand it.
Yeah, I think the darkness for me is sort of the poetics of it is something that, it's something that we not necessarily want to talk about sometimes, even though we look at graphic imagery, graphic media, and it's like shoved in our faces, but we always we conflate it to saying, oh, this is just sort of like politics, or this is just something that's happening now. It'll go away. And by putting myself, it doesn't necessarily have to be me as a performer. I can even hire people to do it as another form of labor. And the consequence of labor is that it really it forces a viewer to say, okay, there's an active participant, not only to myself as a viewer, but there's someone in front of me who is presenting something that looks somewhat mundane, similar to the ordinary, but it is elevating this task because it is so surreal and so sublime and weird that makes me really question my own sort of space within that reality. The idea of quilting. I have a grandmother and a mother who quilts, and everybody knows what quilts are. It's this vernacular, this form that we all understand. But then as soon as you disrupt it with something that's very fragile and something that is taught in sort of tawdry and like you wouldn't expect, like paper, and you're not using thread, you're actually using staples, which is very brutal and very annoying because you want to hear the clunk, 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 clunk. And then if you have a pickup microphone on that, and then it's gone through a mixer, it helps elevate that further. It becomes much more abusive in a way. Yeah. And then that also highlights, in some degree, both the directness of the ridiculousness of that labor, and why are you doing this? Is stupid. But also there's a romantic quality of just this sort of mental fortitude of wanting to get this thing done. So there's that weird counterbalance that happens within that performative act. And it's also the way I do it is I'm not doing it so that's directly in your face, like saying this is performance. It's right. More kind of like, what am I seeing right now? I don't know. And it makes it a little more mysterious and more, and in some ways for me, dangerous, because people can just walk away and not think much of it afterwards, which I actually kind of like.
Oh, that's interesting.
Speaks to mundane.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And it's also, I think, sort of so smart too, just in the sense of once you put the label on a work of art as performance art, it's just going to go off the deep end. Like the assumptions that people will bring to it are going to be so strong and so uncontrolled by you. I will sometimes, there's a lot of, let's see, how can I say this without offending every performance art?
Just offend.
I'm sorry. But I like someone says performance art, and I always think of in my head this phrase, the roly-poly people, because it's just always like somebody in spandex just like rolling around on the ground, like on top of other people. Like that's like all I think of. And so that baggage and that association, they'll bring to that. So as if you have this extreme labor in the history, like imbued into the fabric of your physical objects, which is a huge part of the finished outcome, but willingness to have that go unseen is super brave and really fascinating. But at the same time, I think it reflects so well the labor that we interact with every day that is unseen. This Mac computer that I'm recording this on, I am not thinking about the people in factories in China who put on the glass screen to this thing and wiped it down and put it in a box. That the labor of every object we interact with, for the most part, goes unseen. And art, things that are labeled art get to live in this special place where we're invited to think about the labor, where every other object we're not. And so you're like almost letting your art objects that represent countless hours of labor to like live in that space with other objects is really, really fascinating. And like I said, just like brave for an artist to do, I think. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And there's something always that I find, I don't want to say magical, but find mysterious in that the objects that surround us are beautiful, but then at the same time, all the hands that touch them before you don't know their stories. And that is a mystery that is both beautiful as well as kind of scary, because you hear about everything like the iPhone, and we use iPhone, we use phones all day long now, but you hear about the stories of the companies making them in China, where they're having put like suicide nets up around the buildings because they're working them to like crazy hours to get them out there. And laborers are just, jumping off the buildings because they just can't do it anymore. So it's like this weird sort of scenario around the object that I'm weirdly attracted to as a narrative, as a social narrative. And I think with the work I'm wanting to think about and present is sort of that duality, that sort of the consequence of the conversational back and forth that we need to have more of sometimes, or just present it in a way that people can actually look at for once in reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as the art historian, I can't help but think about it in this context of what as well is that when you look at the history of art in the West and in Europe and the Americas, which is the training I got, art started to take on this sort of privileged status because of the labor that went into it, because you see these early, like, let's say like late 15th century, really beginning early modern period Renaissance, Northern European painters like Jan van Eyck, who just would do this mind-bogglingly detailed painting. The one that always comes to mind is the Arnolfini portrait, which I recommend anyone Googling if you're not familiar with it, and you look at it and it's incredible. And then you learn it's like 12 inches tall, and you're like, what? All of that detail. So it really is these feats of labor that no one else could do, besides the Arnolfini brothers. And so it's the scarcity of the talent of the labor that can go into creating something. And that is where the seeds of it were planted, is like these objects are special because of the labor that went into them. And then as you follow that narrative, it gets divorced from the labor, and all of a sudden you're in ready-mades. And so the value of the art is no longer attached to the labor that goes into it. And so art objects end up in often their own sort of realm. But in the history of it, it is specifically that the labor that made it valuable to humans, because like the scarcity of the talent, the supply and the demand. Speaking of labor, we live across the street from a a furniture shop, so they're doing something out there. So that's what that banging was. But so yeah, I guess it's just sort of interesting to me the way that art sort of in the beginning of what we start to begin to think of as contemporary art is attached to the labor in the same way that a cabinet would be. Like, this cabinet is more valuable than that cabinet because it has carvings on it, and the carvings took more time and more labor, that kind of thing. And then we sort of divorce from it. And then within your work, it's you're almost like wedding the labor back to the art object in a way that I really love and find quite interesting theoretically and philosophically as well. That it's in there, and then it's also the end product is so different than what we would see 600 years ago in terms of the way the labor presents itself as well. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's something that's always in the back of my brain, and it's something that I'm excited for the new work to come out, and eventually, whenever it does.
Yeah.
But it's gonna be. I think I'm really gonna. It's gonna be even far more intensive with it. So it's gonna be. I think it's gonna be jarring to some, but I think it's beautiful to me. So we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah. It's when you're talking about that kind of that darkness as well, it reminds me of, so I'm not a printmaker. This is the open secret. I'm a print, I'm a hanger on, I'm a print groupie and enthusiast and historian. And I've made one proper print in my entire life. And it was a lino cut. And my husband, the editor of the podcast, Tim, he has done huge scale relief cuts in his life, and so he's helping me, design and carve the block. I'm like, well, how do I get this texture? How do I get that texture? And he'd be like, okay, like this, and you want to like hold the tool like this, and use it at this angle if you want that texture, etc., etc. Making it like this and that. And then I finally asked him, I was like, okay, so how do you do this? You do that. How do you do this? You do that. And then I was like, and then how do you keep your back from hurting? And he was like, if you figure that out, you tell me,
Yeah, if you figure that out, there'll be so many printmakers who will give you money.
Yes, exactly. We will make $1 million, right? If you figure that out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was thinking about that as well, is that the actual toll that it takes on human bodies is real. Is very real, and is something that, again, I don't think gets talked about much. Yeah, interestingly enough. Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's I've always dreamed of making a print-centric exercise video. Spandex and 80s style with like headbands and everything. Like, I would just love to I keep on threatening myself every year I'm going to do this for my students. I'm going to make on VHS exercise video where they have to watch it before every class.
I love it. I mean, there's the yoga for runners, right? There's the Pilates for desk workers, and you can have the workout for printmakers now. I think that's great. That's great. Yeah. So I want to make sure that we get a chance for you to kind of talk about a new venture. And I think it's something that is maybe pretty fitting, actually, in the context we were just speaking of, in terms of the actual physicality of making. And that is that you have decided to take on, in a pandemic, making printing presses or tabletop printing presses. And as it was explained to me, specifically to help people who don't have access to studios right now and may not still for a while as our pandemic rages on. So I know that you're going to, Tim has said, I don't, I'm going to ask him about this in Shop Talk. Don't take all my questions, but but I'd love to hear the bit of how that decision came to be, and then how did you go from the conception to the actual getting them out in the world? I must preface this by saying to everybody, doing this during a pandemic is the worst time in the world to do this because the supply chains alone are insane. It's insane.
No, it came out by I think three, maybe four things all colliding at once. The first one was I've always wanted to make my own press. I spoke earlier. I have a mechanical engineering. I'm a failed mechanical engineer. I'm like 3 credits shy of actually being able to be a practicing mechanical engineer. So I'm kind of like this sort of like failed engineer, but I've always wanted to make a press. And so that was always in the lizard part of my brain. And then the pandemic happened. And right when the pandemic happened, a few months before that, I was starting to make a press for a specific project where I'm laminating paper to make like extreme plywood out of paper for a future project. And so I was making that piece. I was just literally making the press that would be a sculptural piece within the project itself. And I was looking. I was like, oh, this could actually be a printmaking press. I just have to change a few things out. Blah blah blah. And I was posting some images online on Instagram on stories, and I had some friends back home who in the States were like, Mitch, are you making a printmaking press? I'm like, kinda,
yeah.
like, and it's like, well, if you're making one, I'll buy one. I'm like, this is, pre-pandemic. So I was like, okay, this is how much it's going to cost, I think. And then I just made one or two, and then someone found out about it, and then I made a couple more, and then with no advertising. And then, cause they know how OCD I am. And, so like, I guess it should be called OCE. So it's like, obsessive compulsive enhancement versus, than anything. But yeah, so that happened. And then the pandemic happened. And at the time, there's two things. There was time that I had to have a spinal surgery, and I was laid up, so I couldn't. It was like right before the lockdown happened, and so I needed to do physiotherapy, and there's no physiotherapy allowed at the hospitals at the time because all the hospitals shut down for COVID patients. So I had to basically teach myself how to walk and do everything again. So physical activity became super important for me to just be able to stand and walk and lift and so on. So the simple tasks of just like making small parts became really important, whatever those parts may be. So I figured, I can just do that. And then at the same time, I was getting like this crazy convergence, if you will. I would check my email, and I had all these emails from students and staff like freaking out, like, how do we do prints at home? We don't have presses. Because if you're not a printmaker, you don't really realize that the press is kind of like the community campfire. Like it's what gathers everybody together. So a bunch of professors and a few technicians from different universities all sort of got online, started talking to each other and trying to figure out, what can we do to reinvent the wheel, if you will. And obviously we realized that potato prints are going to get really old really fast.
Yeah.
So, and depending on what location, what country you're in, what province or state or wherever, like the lockdowns are more extreme than others. So, so I had suggested every university has, tech shops, like machine shops or wood shops or whatever for sculpture or for engineering, whatever. And by OSHA rules or in the United States, but Canada, it's WMIS, they have to be separated away from each other by a certain distance for safety. And that's more than 2 meters. Typically it's like 4 meters. So I was like, well, what if we just maybe it was the medication I was on to what if we just start making presses? We can actually pay the students who are freaking out about money because they've lost their jobs. They need to make rent, and we can pay them. It's extremely socially distanced. They can learn how to do that, and blah, 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 and it kind of went on deaf ears. Everybody's like, that's too much work. No one knows how to do that and all that. Timelines are restricted, blah, 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 or the buildings won't allow us to enter. I mean, it was a number of reasons. When I was like, well, I have in my mind, I have a metal shop in my own studio. I have a milling machine, a lathe. I have everything I need to do this. I was like, well, I've been making them. I'll just start making them.
Yeah.
Because I also need to start getting physically better. So that was sort of like this weird convergence where I just like, I'll just start making them. And if especially in Canada, because we don't have any press companies here to make presses, everybody has to buy them out of the United States. Yeah, so if you buy if you buy a brand new press in Canada, you have to buy it from the States, which then you have to do the conversion rate, Canadian to U.S. dollar. And then you have to do transport, you have to do the international shipping, you have to do the duties, you have to do the taxes.
Yeah.
And what would normally be like let's say a $5,000 or a $10,000 press or a $30,000 press in the United States, all of a sudden it comes into like that $6,000 press turns into like $14,000 or more, whatever. Mm-hmm. So I just started doing it because I'm stubborn as hell, like my mom, and and a lot of people also told me, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. Like, what about your art practice? What about this? And I was like, in my mind, because I raised my mom, it was just like, well, fuck you. I'm going to do it now more than ever.
Right.
So that was sort of the impetus of it. So like, as soon as people said, no, you shouldn't do it, I just was like, okay, I'm really doing it now. And so that was sort of the beginning of it. And from there, I wanted to make it so that they're very affordable, that they are solid steel, that they will outlive the person. They take visual cues from Chicago, from like the L train. And like they'll print anything. Like they'll print a photogravure to emboss a leaf onto a piece of paper. Like, I mean, everything. So, I over-engineered them just as a mental game, because you're in a pandemic, you're bored.
Yep.
And there's nothing else to do. So that's kind of what happened with it. And then from there, I put it out word of mouth, and I posted on Instagram that I'm making presses, and then people were like, I'll buy one. I was like, okay. And then I started its own individual Instagram sites, which then got more attention. Then I published a website. And then, but before all that, when I was just doing the design phases of the presses, before I even built the ones I have now, before I even came up with the final design, I was like using the opportunities of the money I was making off the individual presses I was selling to the States. I was using that money to be able to give to students to like help them pay rent. So because they were helping me do 3D auto design and CAD work and so on. So it would help them a little bit here and there for food or whatever. Yeah. And just because like, I mean, I'm not a dad, but like as soon as you see all the emails from students who are kind of your children in a way, like because they're all the stress, and it's like, you got to do something. And so I just did something. Yeah. And so now I'm making these presses.
No, it's an amazing story, because it just seems like it is a combination of, just being interested in the challenge, needing it in the world, needing it physically for yourself, the movement from the recovery from surgery, and then just, sheer stubbornness from being told, you can't do that, which is it's so interesting, because I completely know that voice, that person who would look at something like a printing press and just not be able to conceive of being able to create it. And so they kind of assume that you can't. Does that make sense? And again, it's so interesting, because I think it can tie back really well conceptually to the idea of invisible labor, because you look at a printing press and you're like, well, I can't even imagine how that's created, because we're so detached, right, from the labor that happens. And so they just are like, well, no one could figure out how to do that, when really, like, while it's a very precise machine, it's sort of a simple machine, I would guess. And it's really about, getting the precision and the balance that would be the sticky wicket. But in terms of how it works, it's something that turns over something that's flat,
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
basically it's a principled game of parallel and perpendicular. It's all it is.
Mm.
And after that, it comes down to pressure. But I mean, I mean, I don't know. It was when people were saying you can't do that or you shouldn't do that, whatever. The one voice that kept on coming back in my head was when I was a kid. My mom would always tell me that it's like when people say that, it's not that it can't be done. It's because they either cannot or will not do it, and don't be that person.
Yeah.
So, and I was like, okay, that my mom's always sort of like in that back of my head, sort of like, just be like, always do what your mom says type thing,
Yeah, Mama knows
yeah.
best. Yeah, I like it.
Oh yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, why don't we can kind of close up because we're getting to our hour recording mark here. So why don't you please let people know where they can see these presses, because they are really beautiful, I have to say.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can tell that they, they look precise, and they look like they say functional, but that always sounds so like they look functional. It always doesn't really sound like a compliment, but they look like very versatile little simple machines, but they're also beautiful. Like, you can tell that you took design and balance into consideration when making them as well. So they're lovely just to see. So where can people see them, find them, maybe even think about getting one for themselves? Where is all that found?
Yeah. You can find them in one of three different locations. One is either on the website, mitchellpressworks.ca. Also, Mitchell/press/works on Instagram, or through my website, my own personal website, mitchmitchellart.com. So, if anybody's ever got any questions about them, I do the dreaded Zoom calls. I'll have a Zoom call with them, sort of explaining things. And
lovely.
Yeah. And then, so it's just any questions whatsoever. And then from there, it makes it better. I also note that for every 10 presses that I sell, I actually donate one press. It's all out of my own pocket and everything, with even shipping. I donate a press to an arts community in need in Canada.
That's
great. As a sort of a forward thank you to the community.
That's wonderful. I love hearing stories of tabletop presses going out there into the world and hopefully inspiring, someone who may not have access to printmaking otherwise, and lighting a spark. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I do want to circle back to the beginning for a moment. It was Maddie Berger who reached out to me. Yeah, and so I realized at the beginning when you were doing the introduction, I was like, I didn't actually ask her if I can give her a shout out on air, and so I'll ask her, and if she says yes, we can leave this part in. So thank you, Maddie, for connecting
Maddie.
us.
Maddie's great.
Yeah,
Maddie's been absolutely exceptional. She's one of my assistants in the press business, and she's a wonderful student at the Concordia, and she is phenomenal. She is absolutely a hard worker and just like a go-getter. She's awesome.
Awesome. Well, I think if you follow the Mitchell Press on Instagram, you'll see pictures of Maddie in the shop, and I think that's just wonderful. So thank you, Maddie, for bringing us together. It's been super fun to talk and pontificate on labor and the lightness and the darkness, and I'm glad that your kitties left your internet cord alone for our talk.
She's looking at it right now. She's just like, I want to play.
But and you're gonna stick around with us a little longer and talk some shop with Tim, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Mitch, and definitely stay in touch, and I hope that we can work together more in the future. This was really fun to talk. Yeah,
definitely. Thank you very much. It's been absolutely fantastic and great to virtually meet you and Tim as well.
Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guest will be Sofia Salazar. We'll talk about growing up in Argentina in an artistic family, her choice to move to the UK, building up her career and brand to the point that she's now making a living off her art, growing her Instagram presence, and finding a balance in mental health while relying so much on social media to reach her audience. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.